God's will.
What you're seeking is a blessing from God.
You must expect a miracle.
You have the power of choice.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Life Today Live. I'm Randy Robinson. Good to have you here today. And one thing I will say I like about God, that's an odd thing to say, but one thing I like about God is how he relates to everybody right where they're at. I was talking to Philip Yancey, if I can name drop. He's on the show. And he was talking about how he related to God through romantic love. And I had to ask him to explain that because I was like, what? How does that work? But, I'll talk to a musician and they'll explain how, a classical music or something like that, it evokes a sense of awe and of a creator, an artist looking at a great work of art and just understanding aesthetic beauty. These things point to God. For me, it's when I'm outside, when I'm up at the Continental Divide and I just see the beauty of this giant temple that I think is just this. It's just where it's at, man. That's so. But God will do that wherever you're at. Well, how does he meet a homicide detective where he's at? You're going to find out today because my guest today is a detective of cold cases right now, working active cases. His name is J. Warner Wallace, and he has a book that takes this angle of finding God and puts it in a book. He's actually had several books, but I'll show you the new one. It's called Person of Interest, and it is not on the screen right now. Where did it go? Well, there it is. Person of Interest, a little technical hitch. He has written several books, Cold Case Humanity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith. These are all books that take a very investigative angle on who is Jesus. Was he real? Did he walk the earth? Good questions. We're going to find out today. Jim, he said to call him Jim. Jim, welcome to Life Today Live.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, Jim is a good way to address it. Better than detective or Jay Warner for sure.
Okay, I like Jay Warner. It makes you sound like a character in a crime series on TV or something, right?
Well, my grandfather's name was Warner. I loved that name as an adult. I didn't like it as a kid, but as the more I got to know my grandfather, the more I was like, I wish my first name was Warner. Right? So my search warrants always had J. Warner Wallace on them. So when I started writing books, I just used that name.
You're the first one to come on Live Today and say, well, that's what my name is on my search warrants.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into the book, before we get into Person of Interest, I really want people to have a sense of your history in the crime-solving business. So give us the little bit of an overview of what you've done with your life in solving cases.
Well, I'm part of a 3-generation law enforcement family. A lot of us become police officers and eventually do other assignments while you're working in law enforcement. Some of us promote. I kind of got locked into detectives and investigating crimes. Eventually, I was assigned to robbery homicide. I worked those cases for a number of years, about 5. Then we opened up a collateral duty originally to go back and look at some of our old unsolved cases. And, as a collateral duty, none of us wanted to add another case to our plate. We all had fresh homicides. Why would I want to try to take one of these old ones that nobody's calling about? It's been 30 years since the crime occurred. But I got injured on duty. I hurt my neck and I was just recovering and I was working light duty and I picked up one of these cold cases and I solved it. And that launched an entire second career, really, just working cold cases. We formed a team. Dateline started to come around and wanted to know what we were doing. And so all my cases ended up on Dateline. So it started a whole new chapter. Now, early on, I was not a Christian I wasn't raised in a Christian family. But I was interested in determining truth. And actually, I walked into a church with my wife who was really more interested in looking at this than I was. But I would have been happy to go as an atheist. I would have been more than happy to go to church as a non-believer if it made her happy. But this pastor was so clever. He threw Jesus in a way that I could catch him. He said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. And that's what provoked me to kind of apply the skill set that I had as a detective to the Gospels to see if they were reliable. And I was so distrusting of the Gospels, so distrusting of anything that you would have called Bible, that I really needed to come at it a couple of ways. Like, is this true from the evidence that's in the scriptures? And is this true from the evidence that's not in the scriptures? I mean, I really needed to come at it both ways. And that's the second part of that investigation is what I've written about now in a book called Person of Interest.
Okay, so I have watched my fair share of, probably more than my fair share of crime dramas on TV, so I feel like an expert. And I say that facetiously, but if there is no body, there is no crime, I'm told, right? If you don't have evidence of a crime, then crime didn't occur. So if we don't have, how do we know Jesus was real other than some, fanciful book written by humans?
Well, so I look at this issue of no body murders, and sometimes they're called no body missings. In other words, you've got somebody reported missing and you never find the person.
Yeah.
It's a husband who kills his wife, a wife who kills her husband. It's a business partner who kills his partner, and then says they just ran off or doesn't say anything. Just, well, where is this person? Oh, I don't know. I haven't seen him in weeks. They basically go missing, and we're to believe that nothing nefarious happened. They just decided to drop off the face of the earth. Now, some of these things get taken as missing persons cases. And I've had a couple of these where nobody wants to touch these. No prosecutor wants to handle these. You got to do two things with these cases in front of a jury. Number one, convince the jury that the dude is dead. Okay, that's the biggest problem because you have no body. And like you said, no body, no crime. And the second thing is to convince the jury that this other person is responsible for that dead body. So it's a difficult task. And that is really the equation I'm looking at when I was looking at Jesus for the first time. So let me put it to you this way. How do you make a case when you've got 30 years ago, they took a missing persons report. 30 years ago, they didn't even bother to photograph the crime scene. They didn't treat it like a crime. And they didn't work it for 5 years. Someone gets transferred. Nobody touches the case. Now, 35 years later, I come back to it. It's clear this person never showed up on planet Earth for 30 years. Really, this is a murder. But how do I demonstrate that when I've got no evidence from the crime scene because nobody even bothered to photograph it back in the day? Well, what we tell the jury is that if this was a nefarious act, if this person was murdered on the day they went missing, quote unquote, well, it's as though a bomb exploded. And every bomb's got a fuse. And every time the bomb explodes, there's shrapnel and debris all over the crime scene. So what we're going to do is demonstrate to you what happened on the day the bomb exploded by simply tracing the fuse and the fallout. The fuse and the fallout will point to exactly what happened. There's stuff that this person did before the murder, preparing for the murder. The suspect had to get certain things in place. And then there's stuff the suspect did after the murder that kind of tips the hat and tips his hand and gives him away. So I thought, if I'm going to examine Jesus, I did an examination of the New Testament. Don't get me wrong. But I also thought there should be evidence outside the New Testament. In other words, think of it this way. If some regime had come in and destroyed every New Testament, so they're all just gone, would we have enough evidence just from the fuse and fallout of history to, number one, reconstruct the story of Jesus in its entirety? Because that's what we're doing in these crime scenes. We're saying, hey, I don't have a crime scene, but I have enough evidence from the fuse and the fallout to reconstruct the crime scene. Well, that's what we're going to do with Jesus in this book, Person of Interest. We simply take a look at the fuse leading up to Jesus and the fallout of history after Jesus. And I'm not just going to show you what an impact he had, because the impact is unparalleled. But I'm going to show you that his fingerprints, the data points of his entire life, ministry, death on the cross, resurrection, ascension, all of it are recoverable from the fuse and the fallout. And that's what we do in the book, to show you that's the kind of impact he has, which is exactly the kind of impact you probably should expect if he is, God incarnate and comes into his creation. Right. So that's what we're doing in this book. And really, for skeptics, my goal is there anyone who's interested? I just want people to be able to realize that this is an evidential case that's far more robust than just reading the New Testament.
Okay, that's an interesting claim right there. And I like this because, unfortunately, Christians, most of them are not very good at or completely unable to really argue Christ outside of the Bible. So if someone rejects the Bible, what do you have left to even discuss? And I'm not that great at it either, and I've done interviews like this. You'd think I'd be better. So I'm curious when you. Well, let's go to both of those things, and I want you to touch on some of the extra biblical evidence outside of Scripture. So set your Bible aside for a second. Come back to it. But let's look at the fuse side of it, the setup to the crime or the explosion of Christ coming to the earth. What are you looking to to determine that?
Well, it's interesting that Paul says that Jesus arrives in the fullness of time. And that's like an interesting expression. What is it that is so full about time that Jesus has to arrive when he does? Yeah. Why couldn't he have arrived 1,000 years earlier or 1,000 years later? Well, it turns out, if you look at the fuse, there are several strands that seem to open up a window of opportunity in which God could enter into his creation and have an unparalleled impact. These strands, as I see them, are both spiritual, cultural, and prophetic. And when I say spiritual, what I mean is there are a number, and this book is entirely illustrated. There's over 400 illustrations. There's not a single page you're going to open where you're not going to have an illustration. That's just the way we designed it, because it's a visual case, and you have to see this fuse burn. You have to see what I'm talking about on the timeline to really make sense of it, but I'm going to try to give it to you in a synopsis. From the spiritual side, you have all of these mythologies that precede the appearance of Jesus in history: Osiris and Attis and Heracles and Mithras. You could name all the different cultures, all of whom have a set of gods that they worship. Interestingly, the gods they worship have similarities, very broad, not when you get into the specifics, but very broadly they do. For example, almost all of them will appear miraculously in nature. Almost all of them can perform miracles. Well, these are the common expectations that all of us have as humans. But if God wanted to enter into the world in a time when the most number of worshiping humans are worshiping these myths that share the same common characteristics, and I counted 15 as I studied through these myths. Now, no myth has more than about 10, and none has less than about 6. But there is one person who shows up in history at a window in which all of these myths are being simultaneously worshipped, who possesses all 15 attributes broadly. That is only one person who does that. That's Jesus of Nazareth. So it's interesting to me that Jesus appears at a time which is opportunistic, based on just the spiritual history of the ancients. Right. Also, there's a cultural history of the ancients. It turns out that if Jesus appears 200 years earlier, well, then there won't be any roads for Paul to walk on to preach Jesus to the known world around the Mediterranean. But it turns out that there is a cultural fuse of the Roman Empire that's burning that not only solidifies a common alphabet, the Etruscan alphabet, it solidifies a common technology, or papyrus, and a common spoken Greek language, and then has a 200-year period of peace called the Pax Romana, in which the infrastructure can be built, because you're not just waging wars, you're actually building roads, bridges, tunnels, postal services. This window opens up during the Pax Romana. When you overlap that window on the spiritual window, and then you add a last window, you got to see it to understand it completely. That's why I've got illustrations. But the prophetic window, in which Daniel says that the Messiah will arrive between the edict to restore Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, that's a small window. Now you overlap all the windows. Here's what you're going to get: a window that opens up with all three from about 30 BC to about 70 AD. And Jesus arrives right in the middle of that window. It is as though these aspects of human ancient culture, prophetic and spiritual and just cultural, seem to overlap and provide this window of opportunity. And you can reconstruct a broad outline of what it is that'll change everything. Look, there's a reason why we call this the first century. It's not the first century. It's not the first century that humans lived or the first century that we've recorded history. But we call it that. Why? Because something happens in that window that changes everything. And what could that be? Well, you get that from the fallout. Something's going to happen. Even if I didn't know anything about Jesus, I would know from just the fuse that something's going to happen in that window. And sure enough, it does. Now the question is, what is the something?
Okay, we're going to talk about that. I want to show you guys this. I love this. We're going to show you the book again. It's called Person of Interest. You can go get it now wherever you get books, and you'll get way more than you're getting in this interview, because we can just barely scratch the surface here, and you'll get the color illustrations. I have a question for you, before we get to the fallout. Did you look for any sort of, okay, when you were talking about all the different myths all around the world that have this commonality in them, critics of Christianity will say, well, Jesus wasn't even original. He was taking from all these myths to pull the strings on all these hearts and stuff, and therefore he was just a copycat, Yeah. I remember early days of the internet, there are all these internet going around, and most of them were about 50% even accurate in their history, but that's an aside.
No, I know. That's the other problem.
Did you look,
they're not accurate.
Did you look for any originator? Because I think I may know where all that have come from, and the originator of the various myths?
Okay, so they span 3000 BC all the way to about maybe 500 AD. So and some of these, by the way, I'm even including things like Buddhism and Hinduism, which still continue to be in existence today.
Right.
But my point, and some of them are on the South American continent. They're not always just in that region. So what's interesting is that yes, they are. There are the similarities are only broad. So if you said, oh, yeah, I'm going to appear supernaturally, well, one's going to emerge out of the side of a mountain, leaving a hole. One is going to come out of the thigh of another god. Jesus is born of a virgin. The similarities stop, really, when you get into the details.
Yeah.
So what these really are just the broad expectations. As C.S. Lewis says, these are the myths that come from the minds of poets and men. He's using the word myth to say story about God. Whereas he says Jesus is God's myth, grounded in what we call real things. And that's the difference, is that Paul's talking about this in Acts 17. You folks are really religious, but I'm here to show you something.
Yeah.
The real God. He's saying basically your gods come out of your minds. Our God is known to us by way of observation. Very different.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between Jesus and the other myths. So the similarities to me are not that, by the way, you really think the Jewish writers writing the Gospels are trying to convince a Jewish group, because clearly they're quoting Jewish scripture to do this. Right. They're going to try to convince a Jewish group that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah by cobbling together the pagan myths that they've been warned to avoid their entire history. Okay. So that's the claim. Okay. That's ridiculous. But the point is, he's not that similar. He just meets the broad expectations. Remember, when the expected meets the expectations of the expector, you get better results. God meets our expectations, as Paul was saying in Mars Hill.
Yeah.
Your poets are even writing about this, and he had read the poets, but he's saying, here's the real God.
I love that. That's very true. Very great. Very good point. Solid. Just kind of, frankly. Do you know what the Mazzaroth is?
Yes, I do. Why do you ask?
I ask because I think maybe
because you think that might be an original source of information.
I'm sorry. Ask the question again.
You're thinking that it might be an original source of information about.
I think that after the fall of man, God may have written his plan of salvation in the stars, because they laid out there and look. If you've ever been to a really dark spot on the earth, you know what an impact the stars have. It's not what we get around here in the U.S. And I think God may have laid out his plan, because if you look at the Mazzaroth, it's the plan of salvation in quadrants over and over, like a retelling of the story of salvation. And then you look at all the myths and how similar they are in that hero salvation kind of story. And then it gets corrupted because we decided that the stars were about us rather than about God, and it's corrupt, and we get horoscopes and stupid things like that. But if you go back and look at the original, I'm not sure that God wasn't writing his plan of salvation in the stars, declaring his majesty in the stars, as Psalm says, and the fact that the oldest book in the Bible even references the constellations.
Job, yeah.
I'm just not sure. So,
are you familiar with Joel Amaril's work? He wrote a book called Story in the Stars, I think it's called.
I've read the Gospel in the Stars.
Yeah, he kind of traces the same kinds of things there as well. I know one thing for sure. Look, I'm always hesitant to make broad, sweeping kind of generalizations, but I do know this. We are clearly designed in the image of God, created in the image of God. Why would it surprise us then that we think thoughts about the God who's created us if we are designed in his image? So that's why I think you get this broad sense of common. I show research of this in the book. Today, the vast majority of people on planet Earth believe in some kind of higher power. The number of atheists and agnostics globally is very small. And it's not just that. Research has been done on young people that kids, when they are born, the default position is not atheism. Our default position is we look at the order of creation around us and we see what we perceive as design features we accredit to a designer. Mm-hmm. This is the researchers, atheist researchers in Ivy League schools are now discovering that our default position is some form of theism. It's even been said to be bred in our bones. So it's not as though, as a matter of fact, some of these scholars have said, these are not believers, that it's as though the atheism is the acquired position, not theism. It's not that we have to be taught to believe in God. We have an innate sense that there is a higher power responsible for everything. And that's, I think, what God taps into in that fuse when he comes in the fullness of time.
Yeah, of course I believe that. But I would challenge somebody who maybe is skeptical, who's watching this, trying to follow, for one, just pick up the book, but really taking a serious look at it. I always find it amusing that atheists spend, some of them, the prominent ones, spend so much time and energy fighting a God that doesn't exist. It's like, well, why would you even bother, And I think there's more going on. Let's talk about some of the fallout, because that's where you spend a lot of time, and I think that's perhaps the easiest part, I think, to see, right?
And I know that we're short on time, so I want to just give you one. I traced 5 or 6 things in the fallout. I traced, art, literature, and music. I traced education and science, and even other world religions, because it turns out Jesus is deeply embedded in all of these. And actually, the worldview that he inaugurated is responsible for what we see in all those categories. And in the sciences alone, for example, it's not until Jesus appears on planet Earth that the kind of steady trickling of natural philosophy turns into modern sciences. Jesus comes and the science curve takes off, which I do in one graph in the book. And you can just see that by studying the significant scientists in each generation, in each century. For what we know from historically, you'll see the explosion begins after Jesus. Is that a coincidence? Or is there something about his worldview that's a catalyst for sciences? I think there's 7 things. I'm not going to tell them all here, but I try to trace those. But here's what I thought was interesting. I'm looking for the deep impact Jesus has. There's no doubt that Christ followers are heavily overpopulated in the history of science. Every major scientific discipline on planet Earth today was fathered or founded or mothered by a Christ follower. If you don't believe that, you just don't know anything about your history of science. From modern astronomy, modern chemistry, modern biology, all the way to quantum mechanics and computer sciences, you will see that Christ followers have been at the tip of the spear on all of that. The scientific revolution, that's not our term as Christians, that's the secular term, is dominated by Christ followers, Nobel Prize winners in the sciences. All other groups combined don't match what Christians have done in the Nobel Sciences, Nobel Prize for Sciences. It's not just that. It's that if you were to look at the personal journals of the science fathers, these are the people who started these initial disciplines, and I've listed 950 scientists in the book. I want you to take a look at that, the actual science fathers, their personal notes. From the personal notes of the science fathers, you can reconstruct more information about Jesus than you can from the personal journals of the church fathers. So unless you're willing to destroy the entire history of science, you will not erase the story of Jesus. You cannot erase it by simply destroying the New Testament or the church fathers. Literature is another one of those areas. No one's been written about as much as Jesus of Nazareth. There's an entire body of literature out there called Christ figures, in which fictional characters in the modern age have been shaped after the overarching story of Jesus. They're Christ figures in one day, from Superman to all kinds of other characters you would recognize. And I have a list of those as well. Here's my point. It's that you can reconstruct the story of Jesus from the science fathers, from the top 15 campuses of the top 15 universities in the world today. Why? Because universities, modern universities, are a creation of Christ followers. Yep. And the top 15 campuses, if you just visit their campuses and look at their most ancient buildings on those campuses, guess who you're going to find there? The story of Jesus reconstructed. You're not going to be able to erase Jesus from history without destroying all those campuses either. The top 75 of the top 100 campuses are Christian. More Christians have founded more universities than every other group combined. And many of these groups had a head start, like Buddhists had a very big head start on Christians. Yeah. But you cannot, there's no comparison to the history of education. So here's my point. If you were to research through all of these things, the things that I thought were most important as an atheist, which would have been literature, art, music, education, science, none of them would I have been able to experience the way I experienced them, if not for the fact that Jesus came, established a worldview, if his followers were people of the book who wanted to disciple others. It's an educational, discipling, teaching worldview that venerates an orderly God who creates distinctly from his creation and opens up the natural sciences to us. All the stuff that you love as an atheist, all this time you've been standing on the shoulders of Jesus and his followers. And by the way, think about it. Think about it. No other piece of fiction has had the kind of impact on history that Jesus had. That's why it's good inference that Jesus is not a piece of fiction. And no other mortal human has had the impact that Jesus has had. That's why it's a good inference that Jesus is something more than a mortal human. It turns out this impact is good evidence for the historicity and deity of Jesus as well.
Okay. Detective J. Warner Wallace, will you answer truthfully, please? Have you ever solved a case where you didn't have the body or the crime scene? Have you managed to actually use this fuse and fallout to solve cases?
Yeah, we've done it 3 times, but I'll tell you that one of the cases is actually in the book. So what I try to do in each chapter is begin with the story of Tammy Hayes and how we started that case. And I just walk through it chapter by chapter. So a lot of people who read the book will say, yeah, the best part is the murder mystery. Well, that's not supposed to be the best part, okay? But I get it. This is the nature of this kind of work, is that's interesting to see how these cases are solved. But I show you how the fuse and fallout of Tammy Hayes actually demonstrated that Steve Hayes was their killer. And I did the same thing with Jesus to show you how the Jesus actually is why we call the first century the first century. No ancient of Jesus' stature should have changed history. No one who was born in some small, insignificant town and traveled 200 miles his entire life and raised in another insignificant town, never had a family, never had kids, never had a legacy, never ruled a nation, never led an army, never wrote a concert or sonnet, never wrote anything about himself. He never even had a following. His following betrayed him and denied him. Okay, the people who were powerful, they hunted him. The people that were religious rejected him. They falsely accused him, brutally killed him, and then he had to borrow a grave. This is the guy who changes history. Think about it. This is nobody. Look at all the other people who live in the first century. I make a list for you in the book. Take a look. Do you think those people had any impact on the first? None. These are world leaders, okay? Look at all the religious leaders in the history of the world. They haven't had the impact that Jesus is. All the people who claim to be the Jewish Messiah, there's a bunch of those. They had no impact on history. Why does this guy have impact? Well, it might be because it's not a guy. He's not a person of interest at all. He never was. He was never a person. If he's who he said he was, then he's God entering into his creation. And wouldn't you expect this of God entering into his creation? He's having just the kind of impact you would expect if he's who he said he was.
You hear me chuckling off camera a few times because I love it. If you're a Christian, this is just going to bolster you and encourage you and be very interesting. If you're a doubter, maybe you're an outright denier, you're an atheist or an agnostic at least. I think this will challenge you to think. And if you don't appreciate anything else about the case for Christ that he's making, at least appreciate the fact that a homicide detective can help you just critically think about something. So check it out. A good place to start is the website. It looks like this. It is personofinterestbook.com. And then there's another website called coldcasechristianity.com as well. And that is Jim's website. Where you get the book there as well, but you can read a bunch of other articles, a couple of real good places to start. But seriously, if you're a Christian, you're on board, this is just very interesting. But if you're searching, you're doubting, you're really, truly looking for answers, keep going, man. Keep looking. Keep asking the questions. Questions are good because I fully believe, and I think Jim will agree with me, that God will reveal himself. And if you need a little help, pick up his book. Jim, I appreciate what you do. I love what you do. It's fascinating. It's fun. It's exciting. But I really appreciate you applying these skills towards something that has, in my mind, an eternal impact.
Well, I appreciate you even being willing to talk about it. I fear that we're going to enter into a place where we may not have the freedom to talk about these things much longer. The one thing that would solve all of our problems, the gospel, it solves every kind of stupid you can think of. Yet, if we aren't allowed to talk about it, stupid continues to reign. So it's important for us to be able to talk about the gospel, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Yep, and the good news is, as you well know, and in history, many times they have tried to stop people from talking about the gospel, but you can't. So good luck with that one. Again, appreciate your time, appreciate your expertise. Hope people will check out the book. And I appreciate all you guys out there watching. This is a fun one to hit share on. If you haven't followed or subscribed Life Today TV, hit like too, hit all those good buttons, and check out the book and the website. The book, again, is Person of Interest by J. Warner Wallace. And we got more great interviews for you right here on Life Today Live, so be sure you come back. We'll see you again next time.
The gods of indifference, the gods of amusement, the gods of all types of materialism that are rampant throughout America tonight. And God says you'll have to make a choice.